Herby, welcome back.
Here we are, live again.
Yep, always good to see you, man. So there's a million
Thanks,
things we
Steve.
could talk about. It's a busy world, and there's a lot going on, but we only have so much time. So we're going to talk about Ukraine, Israel, and the economy. And let's start with the economy. What's going on?
Before I get into what's going on, I'd like to just do a quick Econ 101 lesson because, and I want to preface by saying I think that the average person is plenty smart, but the average person, economically speaking, is economically ignorant, and it's not anybody's fault. It's that most of us went to public school, and even the private schools didn't really teach economics. Is just not a subject that most people have gotten into. So I just briefly, recessions are a good thing. It's the recovery that's the bad thing. Now, let me. I know this is backwards, and I know
Mm.
everyone's freaking out, thinking, "Here comes a recession." I'm praying for a recession because if we get a good recession now, we'll avoid the depression that's inevitable later. But
Mm.
just a little like Econ 101. An economy is nothing more than the expression of pricing. That's all it is. It's just a pricing mechanism. And the free market works better than any other system because it allows independent individuals in voluntary transactions to set their prices based on how much somebody wants something and how much there is of that thing. And then value is assigned between the two parties without any interference. And so the value in a free market economy is always accurate. Whether you like it or you don't like it, it's an accurate expression of what something is worth. And to the extent that a person or a country or a political party or a government interferes with the natural mechanisms of pricing is to the extent that you start causing all kinds of unintended consequences, none of which are ever good. Okay, none of which. Now, in a pure free market economy, there would still be recessions. And the recessions are a good thing because that's the natural adjustment of when prices and supply and demand come out of whack. So in a
Hmm.
free market economy, the recession needs to happen because that's how you reset for the recovery. The recoveries are fun, but during a recovery, there are a lot of forces taking place that are building up inefficiencies. Some companies get fat, dumb, and happy. Some
Mm.
companies, overstaff. There's all kinds of things that happen, and it's the recession that corrects all of this really misdirection. And then on top of that, it also ensures the creative destruction of capitalism. The capitalism rests upon a free market economy rests upon failure. So the most important laws, in my view, are the bankruptcy laws. You have to have bankruptcy laws because without bankruptcy laws, the alternative historically was debtors' prisons. And if
Mm.
people are going to go to debtors' prison, if they start a business and fail, they're not going to start the business. But if they have bankruptcy laws to fall back on, they'll start the business because the worst thing that could happen is they declare bankruptcy. All right? Are you with me so far?
Yeah,
Bankruptcy
that's
laws
very interesting.
are foundational to our economy. Okay. And I'm pointing this all out. This is just Econ 101 stuff. Okay. But just understand this, recessions are necessary and good. They prevent depressions. Okay.
It kind of sounds
So,
like the breathing of a human organism. The economy is the organism, and the breath goes in and out, and that's how it lives.
but then, over time, things happen. Tumors take place, things happen that shouldn't be there, and they have to be excised. And sometimes some things have to die. But for the greater good of the body of the entire population, these things have to happen. And there's
Mm.
and there's no to the extent that we try to manipulate the free markets in order to prevent pain or ease things for people who we in our perception think need to be helped or whatever the case might be. And I'm not getting into whether that's good or bad, but to the extent that we do that, we disrupt the natural pricing mechanisms, and we in virtually every case end up doing more harm than good when we do this. And we've done this now to a massive extent. So beginning in the early 1900s, under Woodrow Wilson and running through today, which sounds like a long time, but it really isn't an historical perspective. We have embarked on a policy of indebting our country to the point where now we're we're in a level of debt, and not just us, but the entire planet is at a level of debt that is historically unheard of. It's just it that we are not alone in having unpaid, unredeemable debt. Okay, in fact, in some ways, we're in better shape than, for example, the Europeans or the Chinese, just to give you two examples.
Why are we in
However,
better
that
shape?
said, because we have less debt.
Right.
I mean, as bad as our debt
Right.
is
Okay. Stupid
relative to our
question.
gross domestic,
I think we found one. They say they don't exist.
it's we have about 125 to 135% of our is the amount of our debt to our GDP, which is historically unsustainable. Sooner or later, that has to come down. In every case, historically, that there's ever been over 100% debt to GDP ratio of any country at any time, it ends in a hyperinflation, and we're not going to escape that. The problem is, it's
And that's
not
the
just us;
frame
it's the
that
whole
Elon
fucking planet.
brings, right? That's the frame of mind that Elon Musk brings, right? And Thomas Massey, notwithstanding
Yeah,
either of their opinions on any other issue. But some people think about this stuff and some people don't even think it's a big deal.
that's because it's interesting. I was having a conversation much like this with my youngest daughter the other day, and my youngest daughter is politically much more leftist than I am. She's young, but we're having a respectful conversation. And and I said to her, I said, Chloe, if we don't have if these things don't happen, if Trump doesn't succeed, if Doge doesn't succeed, we're going to have an economic collapse. It's inevitable. And Chloe said what people will say. It was I expected this response, which is it hasn't happened yet, essentially.
Mm,
In other words, people have been making this prediction, including myself, for a very long time, and yet it hasn't happened. So
mm,
it would be easy to say, since it hasn't happened, it's not going to happen. But that's an answer that lacks historic perspective, because we're not talking about a lot of time here. We're
right.
only talking about a lot of time relative to a human life. We're not talking about a lot of time relative to the life of a country, which is what we're talking about.
Especially in
And
the age of when we're
eventually,
all addicted to our phones with our time span being so small.
well, and yes, I agree with you. And on top of that, we as a species have not cannot evolve fast enough to keep pace with the technology we're inventing. So we've
Mm,
created all kinds of social side effects and constructs as a result of all of this technology that has not been healthy. Then add on top of that the COVID lockdowns, where we basically isolated the global population for a flu. I mean, in the end, that's what it turned out to be. Just what I thought it was when it started. And it's not like I was brilliant. There were a lot of people saying this. It's that they were all shouted down as COVID deniers or whatever the hell.
mhm.
But the truth is, it was a bad flu. That's all it was. But the global bureaucracy, not necessarily I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy like they're in a dark room plotting it, but it's a conspiracy of shared common interest. Bureaucracies all exist to expand themselves, regardless of what language is spoken by the bureaucrats within the bureaucracy. And the world bureaucracy saw an enormous chance to basically flex its muscles and grow, because there's government programs are easy to start and impossible to end traditionally. That's what Doge is
Right.
all about. So
Right.
all of this emergency short-term spending that was supposed to go away, of course, never went away. And this is why we and the rest of the planet find ourselves in the debt position we're in the social position we're in, because, why are there so many, it seems so many nutty people? Well, isolate a global population for 5 years and see what happens. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Right.
we've stunted an entire generation of children, but I want to stay on the economy. I don't want to digress out of it.
Yeah.
So we need to have recessions. Now, because our government is currently let's keep it in America for now, and just for everything I'm saying, so I don't have to keep saying it, the whole world is just as bad or worse. I'm not just pointing my finger at our country, but I only care about our country. So I'm going to just stay within those boundaries. Okay. I mean, I care in a human sense for other people in other countries, but when it gets right down to it, I'm about my country, because this is where my children live and my grandchildren live and my friends. And this is it.
Sounds pretty America
So,
first. Very reasonable.
I'm American. I love my country. It doesn't make me happy to see these things. So
Right.
30% so to understand now, Still staying in Econ 101, let's talk about inflation a little bit, because I don't think people really understand inflation at all. And I can tell that by the kind of questions that are asked by the press and the kind of comments that I hear just day to day among people. The only thing that causes inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Inflation is always caused by government, always, 100% of the time. It is, there's nothing new about our inflation. There's nothing new about fiat currency. Rome fell over fiat currency in the end. Greece fell over fiat currency in the end. It
Mm.
wasn't paper. What they started doing was mixing alloys other than gold and silver into their money, eventually debasing it to the point where it was worthless. But it was the same exact thing. Whether it's a piece of paper or a fake gold coin, inflation is inflation. And what inflation does is it destroys. It's the hidden, insidious tax on everybody, and it destroys savings, and the wealthy benefit by it. And that's one of the reasons why we're having such wealth disparity in the country right now. But I'll get to that in a minute. I want to stick with how inflation happens in our economy. So when you have an economy that's 30% government, the one universal truth of all government employees and all bureaucrats is that they produce nothing of value. Now, I'm not saying that there can't be important parts of what a government does. A military defends the country. We have to have it, but it still produces nothing of value.
Right.
Okay, there's no military factories producing goods and services that can be purchased by the average person. And there's nothing as a result of military service that produces any positive societal benefit other than to protect it, which is very important. I'm not
Someone
an
could
anarchist.
make a comment about the military industrial complex, good for business.
It, no, it's not good for business. We're distorting the natural market, but I'm getting to that.
Right.
But
Right.
first, let's understand that whether you work for the EPA or the Energy Department or the Education Department or the Transportation Department, whatever bureaucracy
You're
a bureaucrat
regulating, you're
works
not
for,
building.
and that is a regulation holds back the economy, because you have to ask yourself, in the case of every regulation, why do we need the regulation? It hasn't existed all these millions of years until this moment. Why suddenly, at this moment, do we need this regulation? And the answer, if we're being honest with ourselves, is we don't need hardly any regulations. And the reason for that is that in especially in the age of the internet, companies don't become successful by poisoning or killing their customers. They just don't. Because
Mhm.
in a free market, all transactions are voluntary. Okay. So if a company, let's say, let's talk about the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and meat inspectors and packing plants. I would submit to you, because I've been around them in real life, they don't really produce anything. They're just there. Okay. The meat plant is clean because to poison its customers would be really bad for business. So it makes absolutely no difference whether or not that
Mm.
inspector is there. Okay. And all the rules that are around it and all the rules that are created around it are simply rules being created by bureaucrats who feel like they have to do something. But all those rules do is hold back the industry and make it more difficult to do things. Moving away from meat for a minute, let's go to nuclear power. Everybody knows, except for the nuttiest of nutty climate weirdos, that the cleanest power available is nuclear. We have it right now. If the whole country was if we were powering our cities with nuclear power, then we would not need to worry about everything else. We wouldn't have to build windmills and solar farms. We know that nuclear it's safe, it's effective, it's unlimited. It's we have the technology to
So the
do it,
cynical
but it
view is
takes.
that the regulations are really at the behest of the oil companies, let's say, who want to prevent that from
That's not
happening.
true. No, that's not true. And here's that's the argument of people that just don't know what they're talking about. Fossil fuels are half as expensive as nuclear power to generate right now. If the fossil fuel industry thought it could make more money by being in the nuclear business, they would be lobbying for and pushing for nuclear power plants everywhere. The thing is, from a regulatory point of view, from their point of view, they can go out and frack a well in the Permian Basin, which is a proven reserve, the largest in the world, and produce oil and net energy for half the cost of nuclear today, because and they can do that immediately. Okay, so they can go out, for example, to an existing wellhead that's already been drilled, but has gone way down in production, and then drill it deeper and frack the well and bring out enormous amounts of oil for a tiny amount of money and without having to deal with more regulation. Or they can embark on a 5 to 10 year process building a nuclear power plant, which is what it is today. And there's even if you get through the regulations, which take 5 to 10 years, there's no guarantee that you'll still be allowed to build the plant because there's so many different regulatory authorities involved between the state and federal governments. So the people who say that don't. If there was more money in windmills, Exxon would be building windmills.
No,
If there was more
what I meant
money
to
in solar,
what I
yeah,
meant to say is that the cynical view, or the view that you come from, of, in my opinion, the people who seem to know what they're talking about in terms of economics, that say that the regulations, they may seem like a good thing, but they're actually, at best, well intentioned, but bad for the society.
they're all
But
bad.
but most likely they could even be intentional things by big corporations to stifle competition. No, but okay, we're back to, it was a bad point.
They're
Okay.
not. But now I want to get to how this all becomes so inflationary. So when you have 30% of your population, and remember that the average federal bureaucrat makes twice what the average private citizen does per worker. So and in round numbers, the average federal bureaucrat makes $100,000 a year. That's not exactly accurate. It's actually higher, but I'm just doing this for the sake of round numbers and understanding it. And the
Mhm.
average private sector employee makes $50,000, which is insane. In other words, the people paying the salaries of these people make half of what they make. But let's put that aside for now. That's just the
Mhm.
social commentary.
Mhm.
Okay. The worker in the private sector, regardless of where he or she works, is producing productive results. They're part of a productive enterprise. They're producing a product or a service that people are consuming. And so the amount of money that they generate and consume is matched and exceeded by their own production. However, the 30% of the economy that's the government and all those bureaucrats are getting paid, and then they spend that money, but they're not producing anything to offset their own spending. So what we have is too much money chasing too few goods, which
I
drives
see.
up the price
Okay.
because 30% of the population produces nothing.
I see.
If it, and they're spending enormous amounts of money unproductively without correspondingly producing anything for it. Now, up to this point, we've been able to hold it off by the increases in productivity, particularly caused by technology, has allowed us to kind of keep it up. But this is not sustainable, and we're in a situation now where it's just coming to an end, and these bureaucrats have to be fired because they're causing the inflation in the first place. And the argument, I love the argument that, like, well, if they're firing all these people in the Social Security Administration, old people aren't going to get their check. That is such bullshit. Imagine that the government ran a restaurant. Okay, so right now you and your fiance go to a restaurant, you sit down, the hostess brings you to the table, the waitress or waiter comes over, the busboy brings your water, yada yada. We've all been through that experience. A government restaurant would go like this. The hostess would bring you to the table, but then someone else would come to actually help you sit down. Then you would have the water busboy, the table cleaning busboy, the chair pushing in busboy, and the vacuuming busboy. Then you would have the server who takes the order, and then the one who has to walk it from the table back to the kitchen. They would just This is what the government does. It adds staff just to add staff
Mhm.
with no productive results.
Right.
And since the government can't bounce checks, all it does is write them, which is why the Doge audit is taking a long time because they're having to go through essentially what is let's just it's an imaginary, but imagine there's a check register. The government's just been writing checks without filling in what they're for and who they're going to. And this is in every federal department. And since they literally cannot bounce a check, they just don't give a shit. So at this point, the the upside to all of this is that here's the best possible outcome. We have a very, very bad recession right now. Okay. And get it out. And the stock market and the real estate market are we've been having a hyperinflation. We just didn't notice it. So remember when I said earlier that inflation benefits the wealthy?
Mhm.
Inflation benefits asset holders. So 70% of the American population, again, I'm rounding. I think it's 67%, but I'm rounding, live hand to mouth. They get paid a paycheck. They budget it for the month. At the end of the month, they're out of money and they get another paycheck, or every
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks, or whatever the case might be. Well, that means that when there's inflation, they're losing buying power, but they don't have any invested assets. If they did, they wouldn't be living hand to mouth. They don't have any savings. They don't have any
Right.
assets. They don't. Okay, but the wealthy, they've got to put their money somewhere, and where they put it is into assets. Now, there are only 5 places to invest money: stocks, bonds, real estate, um, precious metals, hard assets, and what was bonds, hard assets, stocks, bonds, wait, equity, debt, real estate. Oh, and cash. I was forgetting cash. You could put
Mm.
your money in cash. Well, wealthy people don't put their money into cash. Not very much. Where they generally put their money is into stocks or real estate, usually both. So we've had a super bubble take place in both. The price of stocks and the price of real estate today cannot be justified, okay, other
Mm.
than it's been inflated, because all this money that we've been spending since basically the crash of the last real estate market in 2008, all of this money that both parties have been pumping into the system has been showing up in asset prices. It's been gravitating towards so we didn't see up until recently inflation in like grocery prices, because all that extra money was being sucked up by stock and bond prices. But we finally saturated that to the point where no rational person can justify it. So now suddenly we're having inflation showing up in other places as well. But the fact of the matter is, it's all being caused by government spending. In the end, all this inflation and all of these asset prices have been created artificially by government spending. Otherwise, they would not be anywhere
So
near
it's a
the levels that
combination
they're
of
at.
the existence of the bureaucracy and the government spending that's causing inflation. It's a
Well,
two hit
the
from the
government is the
government.
bureaucracy. The government is the bureaucracy. Remember, these legislators pass laws and then have no fucking idea how to enact them. I mean, how to actually do anything. They hand it off to the bureaucracy, and then the bureaucracy. The Constitution expressly says Congress shall make laws, but bureaucrats somehow, through regulation, have been making laws for years,
Yep.
and they've caused this. And but more than that, there's a lot of corruption. And when I say corruption, I don't mean necessarily that they're walking out of the building with suitcases full of gold bars, or that certainly takes place. It's easy to steal from an account when nobody's auditing the account. The Pentagon has never been audited.
Mm-hmm.
The Internal Revenue Service has
Right.
never been audited. Okay, the Federal Reserve has never been audited. You could literally walk out of there with a suitcase full of money and no one will ever know. You would
Right.
have a reasonable expectation of never being caught. Okay, people get caught skimming from private companies because sooner or later there's an audit. Okay, and when the audit
Right.
comes, the accountants go, "What the fuck is this?" And then you catch it. But when you don't have an audit, there's no one saying, "What the fuck is this? What is this expenditure?" Okay,
Right.
so, and this has been going on for decades. So it is easy to imagine that literally half of the money being spent by the government now across the board is waste and fraud. Okay, a combination of both. Fraud being like, for example, a bureaucrat steering contracts into the NGO, the non-governmental organization, where he is going to retire to, or she's going to retire to after they get their federal pension. And it's already in the cards. So they're steering contracts while they're still bureaucrats to these NGOs, which
Right.
is under the table dealing and an unfair bidding practice. You can see that that's corrupt. And then they get out and they make enormous salaries, much more than they ever made at the government, while still collecting full government benefits and having government
Mm.
insurance. And the whole thing is corrupt.
Damn.
It's legal, but corrupt. Corruption can be legal. You
Right.
know, there are countries, we'll get to it in a minute, but Ukraine's a good example. Ukraine is not a democracy, it's a kleptocracy. It's the
Yeah.
most corrupt
Well, hold
country in
on.
Europe.
Let me, because I took you off your track before, and I apologize for that. But tell me then, why are recessions good?
Because we have to reset this before it becomes a crash. So if we have a good solid recession right now, let me use an analogy, okay, that actually happened. It was before you were born, and I don't mean this to be silly, but I was alive, and it's when Reagan became president. So in the 1970s, we had inflation much like we have it today, worse even. And we also had a stagnant economy. And the word that there was for that was stagflation, which we're about to experience again, or we may be experiencing now. But again, I don't want to get into that just yet. So Jimmy Carter was a feckless president. He was good in many ways. You've heard me compliment him on lots of things, but
Mhm.
economically he was feckless. He really, really his problems were caused by Richard Nixon. He just didn't know what to do about it. When Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, he basically fucked the whole country forever. But
Mm.
that's just typical Nixon. He did something for expediency without thinking it all the way through, and inflation immediately started. So it got bad. Anyway, Reagan comes to office. He's beaten Carter, and where President Trump has Mar-a-Lago, President Reagan had Rancho del Cielo in Santa Barbara. You're probably aware of it being in California.
Hmm.
Still there. The Reagan family, as far as I know, still owns it. So Reagan was sitting there at Rancho del Cielo, just like Trump did at Mar-a-Lago, and he was receiving people, and they were coming through and looking for jobs, and all the things that take place setting up an administration before you actually take office. This is in the time between the November election and the January inauguration. One of the people that came to see Reagan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and his name was Paul Volcker. Now, Paul Volcker was certainly the best chairman of the Federal Reserve we've ever had. Probably the only one to ever serve in the office that understood what he was supposed to be doing.
Which is
Now,
what
interestingly,
I have
prevent
to ask.
inflation.
Hmm.
The whole point of the Federal Reserve should be to make sure the money remains strong. That's not what it does. It's now intentionally causing inflation. But Paul Volcker was appointed by Jimmy Carter, interestingly enough, and he was a Democrat. But he was the old-fashioned kind of Democrat who still had brain cells, okay, and understood that how business works. So he goes up to Rancho del Cielo, and remember that Federal Reserve chairman cannot be fired by the president. If Trump doesn't like,
Hmm.
what's his name, the Federal Reserve? I'm drawing a blank right now. I can see his face, but anyway,
Powell.
um, Powell. If
Yeah.
Trump cannot fire Powell. He can make his life a goddamn misery, but he can't fire him
Hmm.
until the end of the 6-year term. So Volcker still had years left of his term. I think Arthur Burns was the Fed chairman until Carter. His term ended, I think, 2 years into Carter's presidency. So Volcker was probably appointed in 1978. So he still had till the end of Reagan's first term to serve as Fed chairman till 1984.
Hmm.
So he goes to see Reagan and he sits down with him. And by the way, where I get this story is from Paul Volcker's memoirs. He wrote a memoir. So I'm using Volcker as my source. So, and by the way, it's a very good read. And if any of you ever want, you really, it's a good read. So Volcker goes up to see Reagan at Rancho del Cielo, and Reagan says to him, Paul, what do you think we're going to need to do to get rid of this inflation? And Volcker said, well, Mr. President, the only thing that we can really do would be to put the country on a gold standard. But if we do that, we're going to cause a very, very bad recession. It's going to, in the short run, doing the right thing in the short run always
Hmm.
causes problems. That's
Hmm.
the first parallel to what's going on now. And, it's going to be a political liability. And, you probably don't want to do that. But short of that, I don't know what else we can possibly do. And Reagan said, well, what if we just do it? That was Reagan's idea. What if we just do it? What if between the president and the Federal Reserve, the president providing political cover and the
Hmm.
Federal Reserve just doing it, run the money supply on a de facto gold standard, okay? Not a legal gold standard, a de facto gold standard. In other words, behave like you're using a gold standard, even though you're not. And that is
Hmm.
exactly what they did. So
Hmm.
they pegged the price of gold at the time. When I say pegged, this was an intellectual peg at $500 an ounce, which sounds funny now as it's $3,000 an ounce, but that's inflation.
Hmm.
But at $500 an ounce, the thought was if at $500 an ounce, give or take a few dollars, that's a neutral signal, and interest rates can remain wherever they are. If the price of gold drops below $500, then that would be a signal that inflation was coming out of the economy and interest rates could be dropped. But if gold went above $500 an ounce, that was an inflationary signal, and interest rates would have to go up. And so Reagan said, let's just do it. And Volcker said it's going to be politically terrible. And Reagan said, well, you just take care of your side, and let's just get this over with. Quicker the
Hmm.
better. Reagan was not a dummy.
Hmm.
Okay, that was the criticism because he was an actor.
Hmm.
But just because the guy's an actor doesn't mean he's a moron. He's just an actor.
Right.
So anyway, to make a long story short, that's what they did. Now a lot of people forget this, but when Reagan was shot by John Hinckley, he was really unpopular. His approval ratings were like down in the low 30s. They were below Joe Biden's. And the reason
Hmm.
for that was the country immediately went into a deep recession. just exactly as Volcker had predicted. So in 1980 and 81, again, I don't even think you were born.
No.
But I'm positive you weren't born. But having said that, that's not important. That's irrelevant. The fact is, we were had farm failures were 10%, factory failures were over 10%,
Mm.
unemployment got up as close to 10%. It was the nearest thing to a depression. We were
Hmm.
on the cutting edge of depression. Celebrities were having farm aid concerts to raise money for farmers that were going out of business.
Mm.
It was really, really a bloodbath. Factories were closing in the Midwest. But all of these things had to happen because the economy had built up so much inefficiency and it had been protected from recession for so long by this fiat currency system that it had to come out. And that's exactly what happened. So, and every time Reagan was ever asked about Mr. President, are you going to change the course? You know how that thing. And in
Hmm.
those days, the press was also leftist, even though there's nothing new about a leftist mainstream media. The difference is now there's
Mm.
alternatives. But in those days, the press was
Mm.
obviously leftist, and they were very hostile to Reagan, very hostile. But Reagan was a master at dealing with the press. Trump is great, but Reagan was great in a different way. Reagan, for example, got selectively hard of hearing, which was the funniest thing I ever saw. Whenever he didn't
Mm.
want to answer a question, suddenly he couldn't hear it. He put up his hand.
Mm.
He suddenly he was
Mm.
too old to hear it. He would use his age when it was
Right.
convenient. Okay, or he would seem senile on purpose. He would go what
Right.
he would. There's a lot of great Reagan stories of how he used stories to deflect, and people would think he's senile, and he just wasn't. He was just getting rid of them, with a story. But anyway,
Right. That's
every
interesting.
time Reagan was asked, what are you going to do? His answer was always the same. Well, we'll just stay the course. That was it. That's all he ever said. We're just going to stay the course. And by 1982, everything was coming back. And by 1984, he was reelected by the largest landslide in history. Sorry, President Trump, it's true. He carried every state but Minnesota, which was Walter Mondale. God bless him, a good man. He really got humiliated, and it was not really his fault. But Reagan creamed him and won the largest landslide in history, was reelected. And Reagan left office the most popular president based on polling. And of course, we don't know. They didn't poll Jefferson and Adams, so we don't really know. But
What was the main reason he won that election? Was it the revival of the
the
economy?
economy was great. It was
Mm.
Morning in America. He was running ads on
Mm.
TV. It's Morning in America.
Mm.
It was pictures of kids. It was like Norman Rockwell paintings, if you know what those are.
Yeah.
They're Americana. Kids on bikes and paper boys throwing the paper and
Mm.
people watering their lawns. You should have seen the ads. It was Morning in America, and and it was true. Things were great. The
Mm.
80s were great. I lived through them. They were great, but they started out shitty because Reagan understood and Volcker understood that they had to get the shit out of the system. Well, now understand that the national debt when Reagan was in office was nowhere near 1 trillion, let alone 35 trillion. It took until 2008 to get to 1 trillion, and then we just
Mm.
went ape shit crazy. Okay, so it's just it's way out of control. So now we're going to have a recession. Only it's going to have to be worse than the Reagan recession because
Mm.
things are so much worse structurally than they were then. Okay, the stock market and real estate markets are. Reagan did, by the way, intentionally tank the real estate market by changing the tax deductibility laws, and that's why there are no more savings and loans. He put them all out of business because that's all they had on their books was a bunch of overinflated real estate, and there was a massive failure, but it had to happen. It
Mhm.
had to happen because Reagan essentially was a libertarian and he understood that a free market has to be free to operate. And to the extent that you interfere with it is to the extent that you fuck it up. And we've been doing it for so long and for good reasons. I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But the fact of the matter, I'm not pointing my finger. I'm not claiming that there's grand conspiracies or anything else. I think there are conspiracies of shared interests. Okay, like that all bureaucracies want to do the same thing. I think that the military industrial complex, I don't think that Raytheon and Boeing necessarily sit down at the table and talk about price fixing, but I think that they have shared interests. And so they
Mhm.
resist any kind of change in Pentagon purchasing because this is how they basically get away with essentially horrible management. Remember, these are companies that otherwise would be broke, except they've become de facto. Boeing's a good example. Should be broke. Boeing doesn't make
Mm.
money, but because it's so important to our military industrial complex, we can't allow it to go broke. Boeing, if Boeing started to go bankrupt now, as it might, okay, the government would be in a position where almost any politician, right or left, would bail it out because it's absolutely a vital manufacturer of national defense for all. But you can see how, because it's a quasi-government company, there's a reason why those astronauts are stuck up in the space station with a failed capsule that they spent
Right.
100 times the money that Elon Musk spent
Right.
on the Space Dragon, and he's going up to save them with that. It's because private business versus government. It's just the same thing.
Mm.
SpaceX is not a governmental company. It's not a quasi-governmental entity. So it just does everything better, just
Does
like
it not
any other
take? Does
private.
it not? And I'm really genuinely asking. Doesn't it get money from the government? Don't people say that? That Musk's companies get a lot of government money.
Um, Tesla did at one point. Tesla didn't necessarily get checks cut for it, but what happened was California did give them all kinds of tax breaks to build a factory there, because who in their right mind would build a factory in California if you didn't?
Mm-hmm.
And it is true that there was, there may still be, because I don't buy EVs, but there was a vehicle tax credit of $7,500 per car that basically allowed a Tesla to overcharge and make a profit on a tax credit. That's what people are talking about.
Right.
But that tax
Okay.
credit, as far as I know, is gone. But SpaceX didn't. SpaceX gets government money because the government hires it, but it hires it in a competitive bidding process with Blue Origin and other space consortiums. It just so happens that SpaceX does it better than all the other space consortiums.
Cool.
They're
Yeah,
just
that
winning
makes
because
sense.
they're better, but they're not a monopoly.
Right. That makes sense. And I'm a big Elon fan, and I think you respect the guy too.
I think Elon Musk might be the most remarkable human being that's ever lived.
Yeah.
And I know that he's crazy and autistic and all the other things. I understand that, but I also understand that, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, the reason that there are a million plans that he started and very few that he ever finished is because he was crazy lazy. Everyone knew it. Leonardo would just,
Really.
that's why there's so few. Yeah, that's why there's so few
Mm.
artworks. He would start them and he'd get bored and he'd stop doing them. There's lots of unfinished Leonardos around because Leonardo was lazy. But
Mm.
that doesn't make him any less great. Okay, people are complicated. So Elon Musk has things about him that you're not going to like. There are things about him I don't like, but it doesn't matter. In terms of affecting the future of the human race, I am hard pressed to think of anybody who's done more in history than Elon Musk.
Right. And you support what he's doing for America. It's a
Yes.
question. Yeah.
The problem is, I'm worried he's not going to have time to do it. I think Reagan has made a mistake here. So, Reagan, I said Reagan. That was a
Trump.
Freudian slip.
Yeah.
I think Trump has made a mistake. I was thinking that he should have done what Reagan did. Trump should be preparing the people for what's coming. That's what. If I were in his shoes, I would be leveling with
And he
people and
gave a
saying,
hint.
"Look."
I mean, he said it. I saw you posted that, and then I think I was like, "Is Trump following Herbie's advice?" I think he did on that one.
It looks that way, but of course he doesn't really. So who gives a shit? But I mean, I was just lucky. I happened to
Come
say
on,
it
dream.
before he did it. But that was, well, I'd love to believe that he actually saw my little fishy podcast. But come on. So I live in realities land as far as I
No.
can tell. I don't know. I mean,
That's why I
listen,
had
I
to
hope
have
so.
you. I need someone. I need someone who lives there.
I'm an
No.
objectivist, man. I
Yeah.
see an objective reality. I
Right.
deal with it as it is. I don't. I
So
don't
what
see
should?
things as
Yeah.
I'd like them to be.
So what should
So
he have done?
look, what should he do is he should really he should do a presidential address. He should do his version of a fireside chat. He should do what I just did with you
Mm-hmm.
and lay out how the really explain to people why this has to be, why the inefficiencies are there, and why there is no avoiding a recession. And in fact, a recession would be a good thing. And the sooner that we get it over with, it's like peeling off a band-aid. You can peel it off slow, or you can rip it right off and get it over with. And it's always better to rip it right off and get it over with. Okay, it hurts for a second and then it's over. And yes, there are people that are going to lose their jobs. And yes, there are a lot of government employees that are going to lose their jobs. And yes, real estate and the stock market both are going to bust, which has nothing to do with Donald Trump. The other reason is, as I said in my own live stream I did the other day, is that he needs to inoculate himself from getting blamed. Because he's going to get blamed. You can't hint at. He's opening the door to a lot of criticism from otherwise well-meaning people who don't really. There are people that really think that the president controls the economy, and he just doesn't. He can fuck it up, but he can't make it go any faster than it's going to go. The president and the Congress can only do damage. And then as far as fixing it, they can get things out of the way, but then the economy itself has to go. And it's not going to do that from a faulty foundation. There's so many there's the valuations are wrong. I mean, and I'm not changing the subject. Look at the California wildfires and what happened in the Palisades. That was a failure of pricing. That's what that was. That's what happens when the government of California, the state government, tells the insurance companies you can only make X number of dollars profit and not above this number in premium can you charge.
Mm.
And if you do, you can't do business in California, to which they said, go fuck yourself. And they left. And State Farm canceled 70% of the policyholders. They couldn't possibly have known those wildfires were coming. They can't be blamed for it. But 6 months earlier, they just canceled everybody. They said, you know what, we're out. And they didn't get out because they didn't want to be in there. They wanted to be. The purpose of having an insurance company is to sell insurance. They left the market because they couldn't possibly make money because they weren't allowed to price for the risk. And that also gave the homeowners a distorted pricing view because the homeowners themselves started to think, well, the government will bail me out. So the truth is the Palisades, the way they built in the Palisades, either they had to clear the underbrush aggressively or they shouldn't have built there at all. The Santa Ana winds have been coming to California for centuries. There's nothing new about the Santa Ana winds. And there's nothing new about brush fires. One of the great myths that's perpetuated is like the Native Americans love the land and all of us Europeans hate the land. Native Americans set brush fires purposely to clear farmland with no way to stop them. The largest brush fires in history were started by Native Americans. I'd just like to make that very clear. They would start them on purpose to clear because they didn't rotate crops. They were subsistence farmers. They'd farm until the land was farmed out, and then they'd start another fire to clear more land to do it again.
And you could draw an analogy to what we're talking about to the economy. A process of pain to rejuvenate. So I'm not sure if we're going to have time to get to Israel because we're going to go to Ukraine next. But do you have any other thoughts? Any bow you want to wrap on the economy piece?
No, I think that everyone should number one prepare for a recession because it's coming, and it's going to be a nasty recession. And if you own stocks or bonds or real estate, I can't strongly enough. And I want to preface: I am not shilling for anybody. Do business with whoever you want. Okay, this advice is worth exactly what you're paying for it. Sell it. Sell, sell, sell. Remember the most important sentence that I ever learned in investing: pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered. Everyone's made a lot of money. Be a pig, cash out. Don't work. Don't try to figure out where the top is. Get out now, and then take your money and buy Bitcoin and gold. And that's what you should do with it. And now do what you want, but there's a recession coming as sure as God made little green apples. And Trump would be very, very, very smart to get ahead of it because he's going to get blamed. And if he gets blamed, see, here's the danger in that. And this is the last thing I'll say. If he gets blamed, it's going to kill Doge. And if Doge is killed, we're dead. Then you might as well you're working for nothing. Your life savings is going to be eventually wiped out and you're going to lose everything. And we're all going to lose everything. And that's how serious things are. And Doge is our last, in the nick of time, chance to potentially change the trajectory of our finances without having to materially suffer to the extent that we would otherwise have to suffer. If we don't do this now, I'll give you another last example. Everyone my age collecting Social Security, if they don't fix what's going on right now, we're all going to get a 30% cut in 2035, whether we like it or not. It's unavoidable.
Right. Interesting.
Or sooner. You can just pretend for just so long. But anyway, okay. So that's all I have to say. I think Trump is trying to do his best. I think Musk is trying to do his best. I think they're fighting entrenched bureaucratic interests. It's going to be interesting, but they're our last best chance. And we better tell the people that a recession now would be a good thing, not a bad thing.
My final question to you.
Be educated.
My final question to you on this subject is, what is the cause of this recession that is probably going to come, would you say?
Well, I think Trump is going to set it up by businesses hate unpredictability. And I realize that's not an original thought, and everyone's saying that, but that's the truth. And
so he will have some responsibility, you think, potentially in this. He can't pawn it off all on Biden.
It would come in. Well, no, we would have been in 12% inflation by now. I mean,
right. Right. So it's
Biden was,
tricky.
remember, Biden was not the president. Biden was senile since 2017. That's that. This, I hope that Pam Bondi at the Attorney General's office prosecutes this. This
Right.
was the greatest cover up in American history, covering up Joe Biden's senility since 2017 in a with a collusion of the mainstream media is criminal, criminal.
Mm.
And everybody and whoever was calling the shots for the last 4 years wasn't Joe Biden. In fact, he was using auto signature. It came out the other day that almost everything that he supposedly signed
Right.
was
Yeah.
done by the auto
Yeah.
sign. So if he were put under oath now and said, "Explain your signature on this," a lot of things he didn't
No.
even have any idea.
Right.
None.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it would have been worse. I mean,
It's
and I know
interesting.
that
I see what you're saying. No, that's interesting. You're saying it would have been worse had Biden remained, and what Trump is doing with the tariffs, which I don't think you support, may be creating. So Trump may be responsible for what he's creating, but Biden would have been way worse.
I really don't have any problem with reciprocal tariffs. I have problems with punitive tariffs. Okay, so
Mm.
in other words, putting a 50% tariff on Canadian energy is just what the fuck. I'm glad he backed away from it, but that's a
Hmm.
punitive tariff. But Europe is charging us a 10% tariff on our cars going to Europe, and we're charging them 2.5% coming this way. I think it's
Mm.
perfectly reasonable. Look, what we ought to do is that a reciprocal tariff won't do any harm. We just raise the tariff on our side to the same 10% the Europeans have, and
Right.
then either they drop theirs or we leave it where it is. But that's fair trade. There's a difference
Right.
between it would be
Mm.
great if the whole world tariffs suck if the whole world was free trading, but the whole world is not. And by the way, we're guilty of doing it too. For example, you and I pay for sugar way more than we need to because we're protecting American sugar producers. We could be
Mm.
buying it from Brazil and Cuba right now
Right.
and have sugar coming out of our ass. Not that it's
Right.
good for us, we're fat enough as it is. I'm
Mm.
just saying that I'm using that as an example of a crop that we
Right.
protect
It's very
because it's,
interesting.
I mean, and
Tariffs.
there's a million
It's
of them. There's
yeah. It's a pretty interesting subject. Tariffs. All right. Let's get to Ukraine. I want to first get your thoughts on that Oval Office meeting from whenever it was. What were your thoughts on that scenario? I thought the SNL skit was really funny, actually.
I didn't see it, so I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, I didn't see it. I will say that Zelensky might be the dumbest motherfucker. Zelensky is a borderline personality, and
Do you think he was
you
coked
can
up?
tell. No, I think he's a borderline personality. A
Mm.
borderline personality can't be wrong. They just can't. I don't know if you've. I don't know. Borderline is like a conglomeration of
Yeah.
paranoia and depression.
Right.
And it manifests. We all know
More
people
familiar
like
with it than I'd
this.
like to be.
Right. And the only way that a borderline person ever changes their mind is when you find where their bottom is and crush it. That's the only way to deal with a borderline person is you have to find where their breaking point is and then beat the shit out of them with it. It's the only way to
Mm.
get a borderline to change their mind. And that's what Trump did in the Oval Office. I think that it was incredibly rude and stupid for him to pick a public fight with J.D. Vance and the president. And calling the vice president J.D. is completely inappropriate. In private, it's fine, but not in front of the press. And calling the president Donald, that
Hmm.
was just
Mm.
no, 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 no,
So
no,
you
no,
didn't
no.
really, after watching the whole thing, which I'm sure you did.
I did. Yeah, I watched
You
the whole
did.
thing.
You didn't think JD made a misstep or went too
No,
far? He was
no, no, no,
okay.
not at all.
Good.
Not in the context. But I will say this: Ukraine's choice is stop or surrender. There's no there. The people that are advocating to keep Ukraine afloat. What's their end game? See, this is where American military industrial complex traditional thinking always falls apart. Well, then what?
Hmm.
If we stayed in Afghanistan, it would be nice if we withdrew competently. But and then what? Went into Iraq without understanding, and then what? We went into Vietnam without understanding, and then what? What's the strategy to end this thing? Ukraine cannot win that war. Period. And if Putin has to use nuclear weapons, he will. And to think otherwise is insane. When
So
Trump said, it's
why was this so important to Putin? What were his goals to take over Ukraine completely? Do you think that those were his true goals initially?
yes, yes, yes. But understand that until 1954, for the previous 500 years, Ukraine was part of Russia. I mean, I understand that before that they weren't part of Russia, but for the 500 years in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev, who had then taken over from Stalin, who had dropped dead a year earlier, was doing this great de-Stalinization thing. And as part of the de-Stalinization program, he, for reasons that no one really understands, and I've read his memoirs, he doesn't really explain it, but he just decided to make the Ukraine a Soviet republic as opposed to part of Russia. So the
Hmm.
Soviet Union was a union of countries, but Ukraine was not considered one of those Soviet republics. Ukraine was part of Russia. So in 54, it became a Soviet socialist republic.
Hmm.
So Israel's older in those terms.
Hmm.
Israel's was 1948.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
if they can't win that, so I think so first of all, and I say this as a Russian speaker, Ukrainian is to Russian as Portuguese is to Spanish, and maybe even more so. So if you're a Spanish speaker, which I am, and you read Portuguese, you don't, or you listen to it, you can't speak it, but you can understand the gist of what's going on.
Hmm.
Okay, and you can read Portuguese, and you can understand the gist of what they're saying in whatever publication is you're reading. And the same thing's true in Ukrainian and Russian. They're even closer. They're very, very close. Okay, like the capital city is Kiev in Ukrainian, it's Kiev in Russian. That's a very small difference. And I
Hmm.
just use that because it's an obvious example. But there's a million words that are exactly the same. And the part of Ukraine that Russia held before the invasion and holds now, the Donbass region, is 95% ethnically Russian anyway, and speaks Russian, not Ukrainian in the first place. And they had an election in the Donbass, and over 90% of the population voted to join Russia and leave Ukraine, which is never spoken of, but it's true. Now,
Hmm.
when it is brought up, it's always that was a fake election, but no, it's not.
Right.
I'm
They
sorry.
called it
It's
sham.
always a fake election when you lose, like what's going
Right.
on in Romania now,
Right.
right? Okay.
Yeah. It makes you wonder.
Doesn't it though?
It really does.
How about that Ukraine, we overthrew the democratic government of Ukraine in 2014, Viktor Yanukovych. But I don't
Right.
want to go into that.
Right.
Everyone's eyes are going to roll back in their head in boredom. The, 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 yes, yes, Putin was trying to take Ukraine back. But let me explain why Putin was taking Ukraine. Imagine that you are the leader of Russia, whether you're Putin or you're Peter the Great, whether you're a czar or a commissar or a dictator. That doesn't matter what the title is. That Russia has the longest exposed border of any country in the world by far. Okay, Russia has an enormous border, and the border is so enormous that it can't be defended by setting up any kind of defensive positions. There's not enough raw materials, even in Russia, to build a
Mm.
fence big enough to hold back the Russian border. So,
Mm.
historically and traditionally, how the Russians have defended Russia is by pushing out their borders to have a buffer zone. And Ukraine was part of that buffer zone. Okay, Poland was not. So the people that talk about like this modified domino theory, like they used to make the same bullshit argument in Vietnam, that if Ukraine goes, Poland will be next. No, it won't. Poland
Mm.
historically has been an aggressor against Russia. I realize that in recent history, the Russians have kicked the Poles, but through the span of not that long ago, the Poles were beating the shit out of the Russians. There's a lot of enmity between those two countries, but Russia has never considered Poland part of its defensive buffer zone. That's it's that's
Mm.
a it did Finland, by the way, but the Finns
Mm.
handed the Russians ass to them just before the Second World War, and ever since then the Russians haven't fucked with the Finns, NATO or not. Now Finland's a member of NATO, but that's almost they're afraid of the Finns. The Finns are tough. So, the
Mm.
bottom line is no one's invading. It's bullshit. There's no dominant. So the bottom line is Russia was just reasserting its historic ownership of Ukraine. Whether that's right or wrong
Mhm.
is not my point.
Mhm.
Okay, there is something called right of conquest. Okay, every inch of
Mhm.
this planet has been taken by somebody else from somebody else. The ground we're sitting on, when the Native Americans were sitting at the Little Bighorn before Custer, they took it from the Cherokee. I'm just telling you,
Yeah.
that's just the way
Yeah.
it works. Okay, So there are no indigenous peoples on the planet, strictly speaking. Everybody took whatever land they're sitting on from
Yeah.
somebody else, as eventually somebody will take it from them. So Putin was reasserting for defensive reasons because NATO was right up to his door and he just wanted to have the buffer. From his point of view, again, I know he's a murderer. I know he's a dictator. I know he's a piece of shit. I'm just telling everyone, you got to get real. Whoever replaces Putin is not going to be any different because Putin is a Russophile. And that is what Russians are like.
Hmm.
They're wonderful people, but they have a very different worldview than we do. And whoever replaces Putin is going to be exactly the same, period. There's no there's not going to be a liberal alternative to Putin coming out of Russia.
Right.
Everyone's going to get that out of their heads. That's not going to happen. So and so the bottom line here is Putin was surprised, and the Putin, by the way, got caught up by corruption. The reason the Russians didn't win right away is because of all the stealing that's been going on in the Russian military for so many years. So and it was much more dangerous corruption than we have. So, for example, if we were going to order tires for our trucks, for our military transports, we would order the best tires, but we would
Right.
spend 10 times as much as we need to.
Right.
So, the very best Goodyear tire might cost $1,000. I'm pulling that number out of my ass. I'm just using it for round numbers' sake. But we would spend $10,000 for the same tire, just like we spend $100 for a toilet seat that would be $10. Same
Right.
same exact thing. That's corruption. But in the end, the one thing you could say about it
But
is
it's quality.
we have good toilet seats,
Yeah.
good toilet seats, and
Right.
good tires. Okay. The way the Russians steal is that they pretend that they put the good tires on, but they actually bought the shittiest tires and they stole the difference in price between the two. So it looks like
Right.
they came in on budget, but they stole. So when they were rolling all those trucks out, there was a reason why all those trucks were in a straight line and they all had flat tires on that highway. The tires
Right.
all blew out. I
Mm.
know how mundane that seems, but that's the
Right.
truth of it. And then what we do, because we have a more efficient military, which is relative, but this, if you park a vehicle for a long time, you got to start it up and move it. Otherwise, it doesn't run
Mhm.
right and the tires get, stiff and they break. They didn't move them for years. So
Mhm.
suddenly they're rolling out with these. Anyway, it was a fucking
Right.
disaster. However, that's in the taillights. And Russia is going to win this war because Russia doesn't lose wars. Russia will suffer and suffer and suffer, but they
Mm.
will win. So the choice here for Zelensky is surrender now or surrender later. It, if they can get a deal now that lets Putin have a win on paper, like for example, declaring the Crimea is officially part of Russia, which it always was. The Crimea is to Russia as Florida is to America. Believe me, that's true.
Mm.
With kind of North Carolina weather, but still. Okay. And it's where all the rich Russians go to hang out at the beach. They've been going there for centuries. Read Tolstoy, read Pushkin, read anyone you want, and they're sooner or later they're going to be vacationing at the shore in Crimea. I
Mm.
mean, that's just what Russians have been doing for centuries. And let them have it, and in return for he'll promise not to invade. It's just paper. Look, from the Ukrainian point of view, you're buying yourself time. The optimistic scenario, how I would sell it to the Ukrainians is it's either something now or nothing later. That's really their choice. Something now or nothing later. It's not a good something, but it's better than no something. Okay.
Meaning no
And we'll do
country?
everything we can. No country.
Right. Right.
And they're running out of men. They're lowering the conscription age and they're
Mm.
raising it. And when you have to understand that they're doing conscription, not a draft. This is not a voluntary thing. They have
Mhm.
gangs on the
Yeah.
streets
Yeah.
pressing people. They're
Yeah.
rounding up
I mean,
people
you're
into
fighting for
circles.
the life of your country at that point, obviously. Quite literally.
A
I
lot of the
mean,
people fighting don't want to be fighting for the.
yeah.
They'd like to call it quits.
Yeah.
Okay, it's enough already.
So what should have or America have done once this happened? What should we have done?
Nothing. It's not. It was none of our affair. If the Europeans want to do something about it because it's on their doorstep, that's fine. But I dare you to tell me what the U.S. interest is in Ukraine.
Mm. Right.
We have
Wow.
no interest in Ukraine. We did this because our military-industrial complex was looking for the next war. Now that we're out of Afghanistan,
Mm.
so they were hoping they could pump materiel into Ukraine for the next 10 years, while they slowly bled the country to death without any thought at all to all the little Ukrainians that they're annihilating and Russians. Okay, and all those boys and girls being killed for nothing. So as far as I'm concerned, Trump's right. They should force him into a peace. End of story. This should have never happened. This is a disgrace. This is all this. And, again, I don't want to sound like I'm completely MAGA, but Trump's right. This would have never happened.
I was
If he
going to
had been
ask you, what do you
president,
think would have happened if you were president?
I think that he would have promised that NATO will never go into Ukraine. And I think he would have offered Russia generous trade incentives. And I think he would have basically bought us out of it. It would have never happened in the first place.
Hmm. Wow. So
Plus,
Zelensky, another question is Zelensky obviously should have taken a deal much earlier.
yeah,
Obviously.
but he's a borderline. He can't. Plus, he's corrupt. God only knows what he's worth. I mean, again, one more case of we have absolutely no idea where our $350 billion is. But I guarantee you, I know where half of it is. It's in the bank accounts of Ukrainian oligarchs.
You
The
think he's
same guys who
probably
paid Hunter Biden $1 million a
do you
year.
think
Yeah, go ahead.
do you think there's a large part of him or any part of him that's uh, I assume you think, let me ask this a different way. Is there also part of him that's legitimate leader in during wartime?
Sure. Look, corrupt leadership is nothing new. I mean, there have been. I mean, this is a terrible analogy, but Hitler was personally very wealthy, and he didn't
Mhm.
pay income taxes like everybody else. Leaders of these countries, but there's no doubt about it that he was, on his side. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not that's not the issue. Stalin was corrupt. The mullahs in Iran are corrupt, but they don't see the dichotomy between their corruption and they think that they're basically justified by God. Whatever
Right.
they take, they deserve because of the service that they're doing. That's how they live with themselves.
Mm.
That's how the Palestinian leaders have been stealing. That's how Hamas has been stealing. That's how
Mm.
they all steal. They all tell themselves, "I deserve this for the risk that I'm taking."
Right. Well, gosh. Well, interesting development. So, do you think we're going to be having a deal soon? Ceasefire?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we Putin. I mean, it's going to depend what Putin says today, but I would hazard a guess that he's going to take the deal. He needs out of this. And remember what Trump's telling him behind the curtain. Remember that Biden shut him out of SWIFT, which has really been terrible for that's the international
Mhm.
conversion system for dollars and on the international markets. Biden shut him out, which if you remember, I said at the time was an incredibly damaging and stupid thing to do. But Trump, I'm sure, is going to
Mhm.
lift that restriction. He's going to take off all the trade restrictions. He might
Right.
he might even offer Russia a free trade agreement. Russia has a lot of things we need, and we have a lot of things they need, and we should be natural allies. In my view, and I know this is going to be radical, and this is not going to make me popular with anybody watching, but I think that NATO has outlived its purpose. That's what I think.
Mhm.
I think Russia and the United States are natural allies, and we were, by the way,
Mm.
for 500 years before we got to the communists. Russia was an ally of the United States from our founding,
Right.
not 500 years. That, of course, is not accurate. But since our founding, we were an ally of Russia, and we should be an ally again. They are the most resource-rich country in the world, but they have very little money and very few people relative to the size of their country. We have an enormous domestic market to sell to, which they sell nothing to now. You can't name a Russian product that you're buying. Maybe I think they sell tractors. I think Kubotas are actually made in Russia, but I think that's
Mm.
about it. And I might be wrong about that, but I think I'm right. But the bottom line is our market and our expertise and our investment capital flowing into Russia could only be good for everybody.
Right.
Especially if we kill the military industrial complex and say, you know what, here's going to be what America should do is say, look, we're going to be the guarantors in the future of global free trade on the high seas. Okay, most
Mhm.
trade travels by the high seas. The greatest thing that America has going for it is its navy. Our navies should be bigger, much bigger, and we should guarantee free flow of goods and services
Mm.
in all the world's oceans, all 7 oceans and seas in the world. By the way, you know how I know there are 7, just without even thinking of it? Because that's how many slats there are in the front of a Jeep. If you ever look at a Jeep, there are 7 slats. That's the 7 oceans of the world, the 7 continents of the world. Sorry, the 7 continents of the world.
Mm.
It's interesting. I don't know, it's trivia.
Also,
So
you were in
that's
the
why every
Navy,
week,
so that might have played a role in your knowledge there.
I don't know. I just have a mind for useless trivia. I pick this shit up. I don't even know where I pick it up, and then it sticks, and I don't even
Right.
know why it sticks. Anyway, but then it comes up in conversation. So it's
Yeah.
the bottom line here is, why are we Russia's enemy? In
Right.
1992, we just couldn't take
Right.
yes for an answer.
Mm.
I mean, we made a huge mistake, all for the military-industrial complex.
Mm.
We should close our bases in Europe. We should close our bases in Asia, with maybe one or two exceptions for naval bases. We will need our naval bases, like in Guam and in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and so on and so forth. And maybe in Africa, we have a base. I think now in Somalia. I know that we're refueling ships in Qatar. Those kind of things are
Hmm.
important to keep the trade open. But I don't know why we're projecting land power. We're not going to fight any
Right.
more global world wars. I don't even know why
Mm.
we need a standing army. I mean, I know this is sacrilegious, but I don't think we need a standing army at all. I think we could take the whole thing into reserves and have a Marine Corps. That's all the ground troops we need.
Mm.
The Marine Corps and maybe combine our Army Special Forces into the Marine Corps, because we need those guys for the rescues and brief and. But the days of sending armies into Europe are over.
Right. That's
It's not going to happen.
It's such an interesting time with
Period.
Trump proposing cutting defense spending, Could we get to a new place? It feels like we're at the verge of a new place where we're talking about living in a new way.
We have a ship. We have a navy now of about 278 ships. I think last time I looked. Under Reagan, we were at 600. We should have a
Hmm.
minimum 600 ship navy, maybe bigger, and not necessarily aircraft carriers. It should be designed. And certainly, why are we building all of these carrier? We should have a serious discussion, and I think that Trump wants to have it, of what the future military should look like. We're not going to fight
Right.
World War II anymore. Okay,
Right. Right.
there's no need for heavy guns pounding the shore. That's just not. We have to rethink our strategy and commit to it, because that's important. Trade is everything. Trade is everything.
Right. That's an
Okay.
identity. That's a value system. That's a unifying concept that you could orient.
Well, if you want to help poor people, the only
Right.
thing that's actually ever helped poor people is a free market economy.
Right.
Look at
Get
the
them that
world
sugar.
and
Get them
look
that
where the
sugar
poor
from
people are.
Brazil or wherever you said it was from.
It was from Brazil and Cuba.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, let countries trade. Who cares what their politics are? I
Right.
grew up in Miami. They're still crying about Castro. He's dead. His brother's alive, but his brother's 90 something. Enough already. It's like, let's move
Mm.
on. Let's move on for the good of everybody, for the good of the Cuban people and the American. We're fighting a Cold War that's been over since 1992, and somehow our military-industrial complex hasn't gotten the
Mm.
message.
Right.
And why do we have NATO? Why? Why is there
Right.
NATO? I don't get it.
Right.
It's not like
Well,
the Europeans are doing their fair share. They're just NATO is an excuse for us to have hegemony in Europe, and I don't think we want it. The
right.
Europeans are going down the toilet. They're every problem we have, they have times 10,
Mm.
and we don't necessarily have to hitch our wagon to that. There
Right.
are there are healthier things to hitch our wagon to.
Wow. Absolutely fascinating. It really is, Herb. You've actually, of course, once again demonstrated your wide range of knowledge, but even right there, very profound ending.
We got problems, but we have to stop making new ones for ourselves. you know,
Right.
but it starts with, and this is why like I'd be a lousy politician. You got to level with people. You got to say to people, look, I know you're not dumb. You just weren't taught. This is not your fault. But now we're going to spend a few minutes learning about why things are the way they are.
You once told me you were considering running for libertarian president. I think that might have been bad advice. I think you would have done well in that field.
I'm actually thinking about running for Congress next year
Interesting. Awesome.
and playing with the idea. But
Right. Good for
I'll
you.
get beat. But it's
Why
I
wouldn't
don't
you?
care.
Why wouldn't you? You have so many opinions that are well founded. So why wouldn't you try to
Look,
contribute?
because I'm going to try to contribute, but you can contribute in lots of ways. You don't have to necessarily win. Power is not my thing. I would do it to make a contribution to basically to the conversation, because
Right.
my strong suit is my intellect, right? I mean that and I can articulate my thoughts.
Yes.
So I would do it for that. But I have no. I mean,
That would
I'm
be
67 years old. I'm going to be
yeah.
68 in May. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like I don't
Yeah.
want to be running for office in my 80s. Come on.
Mm. Yeah, it doesn't sound
You
fun.
know, I'd like to contribute and call it a day. That's what I'd like to do. And I think that that's what's behind my anti-political ideas. You really,
Right.
everything you need to say, you can get out of your system in 4 years and then call it,
Right.
and then you're
Right.
done. I mean, move
Yeah.
on. There are other people. Nobody is, as Charles de Gaulle once so famously said, the cemeteries are full of men that couldn't be replaced. Okay. We're all
Mm,
replaceable. We make a contribution and then we move on.
right.
And whenever they talk about, this man's a living legend, there's no such thing as a living legend. I'm just going to be honest with you. We all
Mm,
need to back off the hyperbole. Okay.
mm, mm,
Everybody, we're just people.
right.
These people up in Washington,
Right.
for example, it just makes my head spin when they start talking about technology. Most of these guys don't know how to turn on a computer. And
Yeah.
I'm not exaggerating. I mean, like, what
Well,
are
there
they
was no
doing with it?
funnier manifestation of that when years ago Mark Zuckerberg was being grilled, and they're like, "How do you make money if it's free for the user?" Missing the whole thing about advertising.
They- And they really don't get AI. They just
Right.
don't get it. And what they ought to do is just stay the fuck out of it.
Yeah.
Let the pricing mechanism of the market take care of it. It will. The beautiful part of the free market is it'll do it by itself if you have the courage and the understanding to leave it
Mm,
alone. The best
right.
thing to do is nothing.
Mm,
99.999% of the time, when faced with what you think is something you should act on, you shouldn't.
right. That's a
You,
perfect
you
place.
end up creating.
It's a
Yes, a perfect place to start.
It's a perfect place to leave it, tying it right back to the beginning. Let me end with a nice plug for you that you didn't ask for, but if anyone wants to hear Herb's anti-political idea that he just referenced, it's in A Radical Reset. You can find that on Amazon.
On Amazon. Please
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
It's in Kindle and hard and soft and all that
yeah,
kind of good stuff.
yeah,
Yes, that would be lovely. But
yeah,
listen, I just love shooting the breeze. And if someone
right,
picks up a good idea and passes it along, it's a good thing.
right. Yeah. Well, it's another great one in the books, Herb. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge, as always. I love doing this.
Hey, Brian, one last thing.
Yes,
You're
sir.
getting married in November in
Yeah,
Scottsdale.
yeah.
I hope I'm going to at least be there at some part of it. Just throwing it out. Just throwing it out.
Fair enough. Fair. I think you've earned that
Just for,
right. I
I
think
would
you've earned
love
that.
to come toast to you and your bride. I would,
Hmm.
I'm
I'm going to
next door
talk
to
to her
Scottsdale. I'm
tonight.
looking
I'm going to
forward to
go
it.
turn this off. We're going to go eat some dinner and talk about that right now. You you
That's
you
the
you
important thing.
you
Love to your
deserve to be
family.
there. Yeah, I appreciate you, man. You're a great guy. I love you.
Back at you. Back at you. Love to your family. Take care.
Right on. You too. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks Greg for the comments. Appreciate you. Take care, everyone. See you soon.